Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar hosted by the Daily Maverick and the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. My name is Janet Jobson, and I'm the CEO of the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation, and I'll be moderating today's discussion on justice or just peace, South African perspectives on Ukraine. In our line of work, we used to refer to the world as being VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. But I recently came across a new acronym to describe the world in the last 3 months, which is BANI, brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. It's a particularly interesting time for South Africa to be engaging in the question of our relationship with Ukraine and the question of just peace in Ukraine. It's 3 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, 11 years since the invasion of Crimea. And we have a visit probably coming up at the end of the month from President Zelensky. I'm very, very pleased to have a fantastic panel joining us today. Got Dr. Tim Mariti from the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, where he is the head of peacebuilding interventions. We've got Zvinka Kachur, who is a research fellow at the Center for Sustainability Transitions at Stellenbosch and the co-founder of the Ukrainian Association of South Africa. And Priyal Singh, who's the senior researcher at the Institute of Security Studies, coordinating the Africa and the World priority area. Welcome to all of you. Before we dive into the discussion, I'm going to just say that if you have any questions, please post them in the chat. We'll try and bring them in throughout the discussion, so don't feel that you have to wait until the end to ask a question. We'll try and get to as many as we can in this period. But maybe let's kick off with you, Tim. Maybe you could, you're the head of peace building interventions. You've got this deep background in peace building around the world. Maybe you can share for us, just to frame what is a just peace? Why do we need a just peace? And what lessons can be drawn from the South African experience as we think about Ukraine?
Thank you very much, Janet, and thanks to all the co-partners on this very important webinar. So to kick off, I think the Russian invasion in Ukraine was a violation of international law and has brought about the untold suffering of civilians through killings and tortures and abductions. And studies show that more than 80% of the victims of war are civilians. And war-torn populations suffer tremendous trauma and psychological damage prior, during, and after conflict. And so there is a moral, political, and legal imperative to address the issue of justice for victims and survivors who have suffered. And there's an adage that a slogan, very popular amongst communities and societies around the world that are struggling for their freedom, which states that no justice, no peace. And I think that begins to give us a sense of what just peace or peace with justice, in Ukraine should look like. So a push towards the negotiated settlement in Ukraine following the Russian invasion in February 2022, I think we'll need to take into account what a genuine peace requires and what justice demands. And in this process, there are some very important lessons for Ukraine that can be learned from South Africa's ongoing experience in transition from the brutal legacies of the systems of slavery, colonialism, and apartheid. I think South Africa, like Ukraine, is faced the denial of the rights of its citizens in the past who were being killed and brutalized. South Africa's, black population, people of color were denied the right to live in freedom. And Ukraine is also witnessing this in terms of the killings, the forced disappearances of children in particular. Sustainable peace can only be achieved through justice for victims and survivors who have endured human rights violations and atrocities that may have been committed through authoritarian rule. And this means that a just peace is one in which victims and survivors actively engage and participate in pursuing justice through redress, accountability for human rights violations that they have endured in the hands of perpetrators, and includes a number of processes that fall under the rubric of a framework of justice with accountability. These processes function on a spectrum from what we call legal or punitive justice, which focuses on prosecution. And it's interesting that the prosecution of apartheid perpetrators is now coming back onto the agenda in South Africa. That's the first one. The second is a restorative or reparatory justice that is anchored on the recovery of truth, acknowledgement of harm done, and demonstration of remorse by the perpetrators as a basis for redress between victims and survivors. And then there's also the dimension of distributive justice that allows socioeconomic injustices to be addressed through processes such as reparations, restitution, evident also in South Africa in the ongoing debate around the Expropriation Act that was signed in January. So in the context of Ukraine, a certain number of legal justice processes actually already underway. The International Court of Justice ruled that Russia in February 2022 ruled that Russia should suspend military operations in Ukraine following a complaint that was filed by Ukraine. And the International Court of Justice in this case is operating under the 1948 Genocide Convention. And unfortunately, Russia did reject that ruling and raised objections over the court's jurisdiction. In March 17, 2023, the International Criminal Court also issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin on charges related to war crimes for unlawfully deporting and transferring children from occupied areas of Ukraine to Russia during the ongoing conflict. Those processes are, already underway and ongoing. So, in terms of this legal justice, the international system has, in fact, already begun to address the crisis of the conflict in Ukraine and is establishing benchmarks for the pursuit of justice as a foundation for redress for victims and survivors in Ukraine. But the South African journey also does provide another model, notably through the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. South Africa's own experience was one oriented towards pursuing truth for victims and survivors as a basis for laying the foundations for a just peace and a reconciled society. However, after 25 years, it's now evident that the failure to fully implement the recommendations of the South African TRC, the families of victims and survivors of the brutal apartheid system are now demanding criminal prosecutions for the human rights abuses that they and their family members endured. And in addition, I think we have to acknowledge that after 30 years of South Africa's transition, there have been major failures in terms of addressing the socio-economic redress for victims and survivors and their descendants, which means it's important. It's an important dimension to also take into account, notably, as I mentioned, the issue of reparations and the expropriation bill that is or act that has already been adopted. So I think that is essentially in a nutshell how South Africa's experience and ongoing efforts to deal with its past, I think, provides a very important model for how to ensure that peace is informed or infused with justice and that we pursue what we call a just peace in the context of Ukraine. I think the ongoing efforts to push for a negotiated settlement, it's important for these insights to be brought into these processes. And I think I conclude by saying that ultimately there is no peace without justice. More importantly, the elements that we've just been discussing are absolutely vital and need to be factored into any negotiation or mediation processes that are taking place between Ukraine, Russia, and Ukraine. Let me stop there, Janet, and we'll pick it up later in the conversation.
Thanks, Tim. I mean, the thing that strikes me is whether, in South Africa, there was a pragmatic decision to come to the negotiating table in many ways, a pragmatic decision, also a courageous one. And what does that look like in a context of war, where there's, physical invasion and where people aren't necessarily, as in South Africa, having to live together beyond the negotiations? I'll leave that just as a thought to come back to. But let's kick off, Zwinker, maybe just to hear from you. What is it that you sort of can share with us about what Ukrainians want to see in terms of a just peace, and how are you engaging with the South African experience in terms of that?
Thanks, Janet. I think Tim started well by putting the spotlight on civilians and on people's experience. And that's, I think, sometimes something that might be forgotten in our conversation about peace. And I would like to draw attention about situation at the occupied territories, because about 20% of Ukrainian territories is currently under occupation. And according to Putin's and Russian government believes, Ukrainian identity does not believe. So it means that at the occupied territory, there is a systemic way of destroying Ukrainian identity. People are not allowed to learn the language, and there is already ICJ ruling based on the occupation of Crimea in 2014 that Russia is violating the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination by not allowing Ukrainians at the occupied territories to learn the language. It's also a religious transformation because Ukrainian Orthodox Church is not registered, so is illegal at the territory or at the occupied territories. Ukrainian Catholic Church is also illegal and banned in Zaporizhia. And then the worst situation is with Crimean Tatars, which are Muslim population of Ukraine. Because already during the Soviet time in 1944, 200,000 of Crimean Tatars were deported from Crimea to Asia, and they were not allowed to return until Ukrainian independence in 1991. As soon as Russia took over Crimea again, Crimean Tatars were the first one to be persecuted, and majorly the structure of Crimean Tatars is banned at the occupied territories. If you are representative of LGBTQ plus community, it also means that you cannot openly, publicly reveal your status, because since 2022, Russian legislation allows persecution for publicly announcing your status. So it means that you move from the identity, from your own identity to the suppressed identity. The second big process that is happening is changing the demographics of population. So not only Putin requires Ukrainians to be registered as Russian citizens, and by 10th of September this year, all Ukrainians need to register their legal status at the territory of the occupied territories, but there is also a systemic transfer of population from other regions of Russia into the occupied territories. And while this is a violation of Geneva Convention, nevertheless, there are a number of incentives. Family would receive 3 to 5 millions of rubles. If they are moving to the occupied territories, they would receive mortgage credits. So the Russia is expecting to move at least 5 million of people in the next 5 years. And those transformation of demographic population at the occupied territories is going to be a systemic issue, even if the territory is deoccupied. So these are the processes that need to be stopped immediately, because what we are still seeing, the problem is getting worse and worse because the Russia continues to make those legislation stronger. And then what Tim mentioned, the indoctrination, militarization of children, forceful deportation of children, changing Ukrainian children's citizenship without consent, fast-tracking them for adoption, because we understand that the Russian government is preparing for the war with Europe. So they need more manpower. Children need to be militarized. They need to imagine, they need to follow the state orders. And this is not free and democratic childhood that you imagine for your children. I also would like very quickly to show a map to explain what territories Russia claims as their own, because sometimes we don't completely understand what specifically we are talking about. In September 2022, just in 10 days from announcing of the sham referendums to announcing 4 territories as a part of Russian constitution, you can see the dotted line on the map. So those are the territories that Russia claims as part of their constitution. 30% of those territories are not yet occupied. So Russia failed to take them on militarily, but in Russian understanding, they should follow the legislation, Russian legislation, and a part of the constitution. So unless systemic transformation in Russia happens, where the imperial colonial thinking is changed, Ukrainian identity is allowed, and Russia doesn't see all the former imperial territories as its own, where it can decide what to do, I think it would be very, very difficult for Ukraine to move into the conversation of just peace. Thank you.
Thanks, Vinka. And it's sobering to see the map and really see how much territory we're talking about. Maybe, Priyal, it's a good time for you to come in and really give us a sense of the South African-Ukrainian relationship and what is it that South Africa could practically be doing? What is our role in all of this?
Yeah, thank you, Janice, and thanks for the insightful overviews from Zvinka and Prof. Maritzi. I think as a starting point, the global geopolitical context has changed, specifically due to the position, obviously, adopted by the current US administration, which I think has considerably changed the prospects and likelihood of the Ukrainian peace formula progressing, at least in its current form. And we should remember that South Africa has been playing a robust role within the peace formula, particularly through its engagements in each of the working groups and in each of the peace summits. And these have largely been led by the DIRCO Director General, Zain Dango, along with National Security Advisor Sydney Mufamadi. And coupled with the African Peace Mission to Ukraine in June 2023, led by President Ramaphosa, alongside 7 other African countries, South Africa, I think, has indeed been actively engaged within the Ukrainian peace formula and has contributed to the peace process outside of its standing commitments and obligations to contribute to a solution within global multilateral structures, of course, like the UN General Assembly. So while the prospects of the peace formula succeeding, I think, are currently up in the air, I think the South African government should, further recognize that this moment presents immense challenges, but it also presents a number of opportunities for a just peace in Ukraine. And this is because, the country, Ukraine, has since February 2022 represented a key geopolitical fault line in the contestations over the future of international order by major world powers. And this has only become more apparent in 2025. We are undoubtedly at an inflection point in the evolution of the international order, one in which countries from all corners of the world, regardless of their size or whether they're situated north or south of the equator, will need to clearly, unambiguously recognize the value of a shared global rules-based order, commit to this order, while of course still acknowledging double standards, the need for reform, fairer representation, or sit back while major powers reshape a system that best suits their own narrow, myopic, short-term national interests to the detriment of everyone else. And I think Ukraine is undoubtedly a stress test in determining what choices international actors will make to this effect. For South Africa, this is an incredibly important issue. We are a country, as alluded to by Prof. Maritzi, that has benefited tremendously from the political and moral capital we gained from our transition to democracy. We have leveraged that capital on the world stage, and we have fundamentally used this to inform our own role conception or self-conception as an international actor that is actively seeking out a more just, equitable, peaceful international system, one that is underpinned by the values and principles of the UN Charter. And while many would regard us as an emerging power, we must be honest and acknowledge that apart from this reservoir of political and moral capital on the world stage, we are in fact very marginal when it comes to our military or economic weights. So, forget about India or Brazil. I think, countries like Mexico or Poland or Thailand are far more substantial than us in terms of economic influence and their hard power profiles. Even on the African continent, our relative position of power and influence is waning amongst other regional anchor states and even amongst much smaller countries. So we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking we wield any significant leverage to play any kind of power broker role in Ukraine's peace process. These roles are largely reserved for, the US, the EU, China, Turkey, and so on. What we can do, however, is to clearly recognize that we have a shared interest with Ukraine and other like-minded countries in shoring up support for the international rules-based system that we see ourselves as champions of. We see ourselves as champions of mediated, institutionalized responses to global conflicts, and that we're willing to play a constructive role in helping forge consensus on solutions that are in line with the key tenets of the UN Charter and international law. And we need to show this commitment to these values and principles, which are also enshrined within our Constitution, and which can find meaning through actionable strategies that yield clear short-term, medium, and long-term results. And yes, of course, we can offer our lessons, we can offer our experiences stemming from our transition. We could offer to mediate in some way based on this experience. But I would argue that's not really what we should be seen as the most pressing issue right now, at this unique geopolitical moment in time. We should instead double down on shoring up support for institutionalized responses to conflict aligned to international law, which reflect our constitutional values. And we should play a leading role in building the necessary consensus and political momentum on the world stage for such responses to take center stage, in opposition to geopolitical wrangling amongst major world powers. But the caveat is we've, of course, struggled with this in prior years. We've been held back from appropriately playing this role, largely in part because we suffer from a hollow definition of active non-alignment in our foreign policy. And this has been informed by an even hollower definition of progressive internationalism. And we've accordingly defaulted to foreign policy positions that I believe do not adequately speak to our constitutional values and principles, nor our material national interests. And we can and we should, of course, critically discuss and interrogate and develop a shared national understanding of contested histories surrounding NATO, the EU, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the modern states of Ukraine and Russia. But we've lacked a sophisticated and dispassionate reading of these issues in our international relations, as we've far too often defaulted to narrow and outdated ideological positions, which fail to take into account the contemporary realities within the international system. It's also opened us up to a raft of accusations of double standards, given our robust approach toward the conflict between Israel and Palestine. But the time, I think, is ripe for a reset in our international relations. In light of the upcoming visits by the Ukrainian president, in light of South Africa's presidency of the G20, and in light of other global, geopolitical developments centered between Washington, Brussels, Beijing, and Moscow, South Africa, I think, is well placed to take a stand by reaffirming that peace in Ukraine must be just, must respect human rights, must be in line with international law and the UN Charter, and must be pursued through a negotiated settlement in which Ukraine is always, always at the table. And in conclusion, I think, the elements of this more assertive, less ambiguous South African foreign policy are already evident. We do see elements of this. We just, having abstained on every resolution that has been adopted in the 11th Emergency Special Session on Ukraine within the General Assembly since February 2022. South Africa has actually most recently voted for the adoption of the latest resolution on the path to peace, which does in fact recognize the conflict in Ukraine as the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. South Africa has adopted a resolution that says that. We've adopted a resolution that reaffirms the commitments of the General Assembly to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and one which calls for a swift and comprehensive end to the conflict. Finally, I just want to mention, it was quite strange. This resolution, the first in which South Africa voted for, was initially tabled as a counter-resolution by the United States to a prior resolution that day by Ukraine, in which the United States voted against. This counter-resolution was subject to amendments by the US and Russia, I should mention, and which they ultimately did not support. South Africa did support the amended resolution and voted for it. And to top it off, the initial unamended counter text that was proposed by the US was subsequently presented in the Security Council on that day and was adopted as Security Council Resolution 2774, which is the first Security Council resolution we've had on Ukraine. So needless to say, the 24th of February this year was quite a confusing situation for us to follow, but it did highlight important changes that are taking place in the world, changes that we must recognize and respond to in our foreign policy, and changes that are riddled with, I think, as many opportunities as there are challenges. I'll conclude here. Thank you.
Thanks, Priyal. Very, very powerful sort of summation of the situation. And so interesting how the changes are happening on all of these different levels at the same time. We've got some questions from the audience, particularly focused in these comments from Michael Clark, from Rita, from Leonard Horn, which sort of zone in on the idea of I guess, Tim, between yourself and Zvinka, we've got two perspectives. The one is, what do we do once there's peace? How do we make it just? And the other is, how do we get to withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine? What are the next steps? Michael Clark on the chat saying, surely the only way to get to that point is to repel the Russian invasion. Do you have any thoughts on how we get to the point where we can really be discussing aspects of what justice, particularly for civilians, looks like? Zvinka?
Thanks, Janet. I think obviously it is a difficult question to answer, especially it's been 11 years of war and a lot of different rounds of negotiations. There were more than 200 rounds of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. And they didn't lead us very far because Russia continues to invade Ukraine. But I think definitely there are some lessons from South Africa in that sense, that sanctions are an important part and they do influence. Currently, there are quite a lot of sanctions that were implemented against Russia. Unfortunately, the stance of some countries that do not support the sanctions mean that they might be not as effective as they were in 60s and 70s, but there is no doubt that they are implementing, because war is a very expensive exercise, and for Russia to continue waging this war on the 3,000 kilometers, because the size of Ukraine is half of South Africa, so we are talking about a very large scale operation. There are thousands of missiles that need to be fired onto Ukraine every single month, and the war is expensive. So I think one is continuing stronger with economic sanctions, and obviously the other one is helping in trying to make Ukraine stronger. And I think Ukrainian Nobel Peace Laureate Alexandra Matvichuk, who was in South Africa last year, she said, like, I obviously struggle as a peace laureate to advocate for more weapons, but this is the only way how Ukrainians can defend themselves, how we can prevent people from disappearance and people from killing. So unfortunately, unless Ukraine is strong enough to withstand its ground, it would be also very difficult to continue. So I think those two ways could lead us to the change of the government and change of the system, the transformation of the system in Russia that would not be seeing Ukraine as part of its colony.
Yeah, sure, Tvinka. It's so tricky, this question of I guess what are the things we need in place in order for negotiations to work. And you know, I was thinking, as you talk about sanctions, one of the points of the sanctions campaigns was to make apartheid unbearable for white South Africans, so that they would put pressure on the apartheid regime to make change. And I noticed Rita's comment that really change has to also come from within Russia. There needs to be pressure inside the Russian Federation to shift its position. Tim, is it impossible to negotiate before the Russian forces have been repelled, or what's your perspective on that? Oh, you're on mute, Tim.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I think the South Africa's experience also gives us some guidelines on this, because the the secret negotiations began way before the transition from apartheid, if you recall, and it's been documented in a book called The End Game, and a documentary and a film, I think. The negotiations began quite far back in the 80s. I mean, serious negotiations began in the mid 80s. with Nelson Mandela already convening some secret talks with the National Party and using envoys in different places, such as Dakar, Senegal, Lusaka, Zambia, to forge some kind of a framework for discussion. Interesting that the corporate sector was involved in this quite significantly. So I would say that negotiations should always be taking place at some level. And if you think of the negotiations over the return of political prisoners, there's already some framework for communication that's already taking place despite the ongoing war. So on that basis, negotiations should be already be beginning. I think they are happening, obviously, behind the scenes. We're not privy to all the information that is happening, because the pathway towards pursuing a repelling the Russian forces essentially requires more resources, more weapons, more bodies. Now European Union is talking about having to place its troops in Ukraine as some kind of a peacekeeping force. That is that's a process that consumes a significant amount of resources. There will be regrettably more deaths in that process. So we shouldn't wait. The point is that we shouldn't wait until the war is at an end. We should actually be working on this at this very moment, going forward, because it is the surest way to ensure that the frameworks that we come up with that are infused with this notion of justice as a pathway to what sustainable peace between Ukraine and Russia going forward. Thanks, Janet.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, it's helpful to talk about the talks and the talks behind the scenes, because I think we can end up with an image in our mind of Putin and Zelensky sitting across the table from each other, and that being the only version of negotiations that really counts. And so really, really powerful to reflect on the experience of South Africa of having, more than a decade of talks about talks and talks about various aspects, which allowed us to move out. Priyal, I've got a great question here from Stephen Gruzd. Let's zero in on Trump. Is there any sign that Trump's presidency is going to change the equation in terms of an immediate ceasefire?
Well, I mean, Trump's presidency has already changed the equation on every aspect of international relations, I think, since the beginning of this year. So when it comes to Ukraine specifically, it absolutely has changed the equation. Apart from the ceasefire, I think the biggest issue here is that there's a break in the transatlantic partnership between the European Union and the United States. We no longer have certainty of US. We never really did, but it was assumed that we would have a fairly good odds of US security assurances for a general Western collective effort or strategy to contain Russian aggression and to pursue and work out a peace agreement with Ukraine, ultimately leading to some negotiated settlements. So that is pretty much off the table. In its place, we have this kind of very weird transactional, strategy that was attempted by the Trump administration to seek out some critical minerals agreement with Ukraine, which, it's quite shocking to me that they would even consider that, given the fact that, Ukraine, again, it represents a stress test for major world powers to commit to principles and values that they are willing to defend. And for the United States, it's a no-brainer. These are values and principles you'd want to, nurture and protect and act upon and defend. But it seems that has gone out the window in favor of a critical minerals agreement that they wanted to sign with Ukraine, because the United States would only want to be involved, continue funding the war efforts or Ukraine's defense if it has a direct material interest in the country. So the likelihoods of Trump, forcing or pushing through a ceasefire or agreement, I'm not entirely, I wouldn't say it's likely, because the strategy employed so far has been to, negotiate bilaterally with different parties excluding one or the other. And, that is not sustainable. You have to have Ukraine at the table if, in these negotiations. It's the only way you would arrive at a sustainable agreement. Just a few other issues I just saw in the comments, with this catch-22 South Africa is in, how important is Russia? We must remember that the Soviet Union supported South Africa's struggle. It was not Russia. Russia is the legal successor in many ways to the Soviet Union. We recognize that within the United Nations. But the Soviet Union was something different, was something else entirely. It was composed of Ukraine as well and many other countries. They supported South Africa's struggle. We must remember that. We also did quite an extensive report at the ISS a few years ago, focusing exactly on this question. Russia-Africa relations in an age of great power rivalry. I'm assuming the link will be shared in the comments as well to that paper. But these are things we must be aware of, and it's something our foreign policy must adapt and respond to. And I think, again, going back to my earlier remarks, many of our hollow definitions of active non-alignment or progressive internationalism fail to take into account these very specific contemporary realities we must deal with. Let me stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Priyal. It sort of makes me think, that question you're saying of potentially building out South Africa's foreign policy into being very clearly in support of a rules-based order, in support of multilateralism. I mean, as you say, the contemporary realities have shifted things very dramatically. And in one sense, I guess I'm interested in the ideological question. Many South Africans that supported Russia did so from an ideological position against the US. Now, how do we look at things when the US may well be on the side of Russia, and how do we manage the situation of NATO in that context?
Yeah, it is probably one of the most important questions facing our foreign policy establishment right now, because it's not a hypothetical. It is what it is. In the last General Assembly vote in the 11th Emergency Special Session on the 24th of February this year, and within the Security Council, the United States and Russia were fairly much aligned in their positions on what should be put out in a resolution. Meaning, and it's very weirdly again, that the US position is becoming very much aligned to the ideological position held by the ANC. So if you look at the position put out by the ANC, with following the outcome documents from the last National Elective Conference and last Policy Conference, which took a long-term historical view of what's happening in that part of the world, and tried to, painted a picture that was not simply about a Russian invasion of Ukraine. It brought into the equation NATO, EU expansion, all of these issues. We see that being increasingly referenced within the American foreign policy establishment. So the equation has been flipped on its head, basically. And as South Africa, we have to go back to the drawing board. We have to relook at some of the ideological positions that have informed our foreign policy. And I think we have to make a much sharper turn towards a more pragmatic foreign policy, a more dispassionate foreign policy, but one that is aligned with our constitutional values and not held hostage by outdated ideological notions of the international order.
Thanks, Priyal. Zvinka, I was thinking you've done a lot of work building relationships between civil society, between South Africa and Ukraine. How do you see that sort of work of people-to-people connections playing out in terms of the current situation and the road towards a just peace?
Thanks, Janet. I just wanted to also mention something linked to the NATO, because I can see there are lots of questions about NATO, and your previous question on how do we work with big powers. I think wanted to remind that in 2014, when Russia invaded militarily Ukraine, Ukraine was a neutral country and did not plan to join NATO. Also, when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Ukraine did not receive invitation to join NATO. So there was no NATO membership on the prospects. And the current situation that Priyal described, that maybe the NATO is not as strong as it was, there was always this question, will NATO act upon its Article 5? So if one of the NATO members will be attacked, what actually will happen? And we've seen already a few missiles landing on the territory of Poland, and there was no response, right? We understand that nobody wants to fight against the great power. So indeed, in this dynamic world, maybe membership in NATO is not the only solution, but the guarantee for Ukrainian territorial integrity, for Ukrainian sovereignty should be found. And at the moment, we don't have the answer. NATO could be one of the answers that we knew in the past, because those countries that were part of NATO members, and like, for example, Baltic countries, they are much smaller than Ukraine, but Russia would never attack them. And we've seen that since 2022, Finland and Sweden have joined NATO. And previously, they were not part of NATO. And again, Russia did not have any strong stance on that. So the question is not about NATO. The question is, how can we ensure that a smaller country that gave up nuclear weapon can be protected if a larger country wants to invade it? And I think this is the question. And as Priyal has mentioned, if we focus on principles of democracy, human rights, rule-based order, this is the answer. How can we make those principles our strengths? Because currently, where we're moving towards more and more militarization, because every even smaller state understands, if I cannot militarily protect myself, I can be invaded, and then my people will be killed, will be disappearing, and will face all those sufferings. So the question is, how can we ensure that the smaller state, any smaller state, is not easily invaded by a larger state?
Thanks, Mel.
And then on your question on the civil society work, I think there was really a lot done since 2022, but also prior to that. Institute of Justice and Reconciliation, Tutu Foundation, Ukrainian Association of South Africa, and a number of Ukrainian organizations are working together to put more collaboration between experts so that we do find those answers. In particular, we've done already 3 policy briefs that are focusing on UN reform. What could be the answer to find a solution to the question of smaller state security and territorial integrity? There was one about nuclear safety, because a lot of African states are looking into potentially developing nuclear energy, and something that we have not yet touched today in Ukraine. There was the first time that the full operational nuclear power station was occupied, so taking over in a military way. We don't have answers to those questions. And the third policy brief is on children's deportation. And this is something that it's not just civil society that is working on those issues, but also I think South African government has raised their voice that they will be participating in mediating the return of Ukrainian children. You know, in July 2023, when President Ramaphosa was in Russia, he asked Putin to return Ukrainian children. We are talking about at least 20,000 documented cases. Russia declares they have 700,000 Ukrainian children. While this data is not verified, we are talking about big numbers of children that were forcefully taken to Russia and who are not returned to their families, to their communities. So if South Africa can speak about prisoners of war, about over 30 journalists that are detained, and one of them, 27-year-old Victoria Roshchina, died in prison just in October last year. Now for 6 months, her body is not returned. So all those issues of human rights, of speaking against torture of people who are working on nuclear power station, because, this is what's happening at the occupied territories. So if South Africa can raise its voice on those issues, it would be very important.
Thanks, Vinka. You've reminded me there's some interesting parallels between Ukraine and South Africa, notably that our constitutions were adopted in the same year in 1996, and also that we're two of the only countries to ever give up nuclear weapons, which is a striking connection between our states. Tim, you know, this focus that Priyal's brought up about building in a much stronger values-based, constitution-based commitment to the world order. We now are participating in a range of forums, the G20, BRICS, BRICS Plus. What is it that you think we can and should be doing to bring, I guess, the questions that South Africa's experience of seeking peace might lend us to be asking in a particularly unique way? You're on mute again.
Thanks, Janet. So yeah, the world is definitely in a state of disruption and crisis right now. We've seen that the recent disruptions that have been precipitated by Washington are raising fundamental questions about whether the old certainties are now gone, and whether we need to, in fact, talk about a root and branch transformation of the multilateral system. What is clear is that the rule makers of yesterday are today's rule breakers, and as some are involved in smashing the multilateral system anchored by the United Nations. And on the issue of peace and security, I think it's important to state that I would say the system of collective security that we have has effectively collapsed. And this is evident in the fact that Russia was the president of the UN Security Council in 2022, February 2022, when it began the invasion of Ukraine. So we definitely have a crisis of multilateralism, and we need a root and branch fundamental transformation of the multilateral system. It's significant that last year, India, Brazil, and South Africa, the so-called IBSA Forum, issued a statement calling for activating Article 109 of the United Nations Charter to convene a general conference to review the United Nations Charter. This is a call for a process that will take a number of years. This was echoed by President Lula of Brazil as well. So I think we, as citizens, as people of the world, actually need to take on this issue. First, we need to inform ourselves about this Article 109, familiarize ourselves with it. What does it say? And then forge the consensus, build the links and the partnerships that are needed to actually invoke this Article 109 within the General Assembly of the United Nations. So we have a very practical pathway, and South Africa, as one of the countries that issued the statement, actually has a role to play, a very significant role to play, and its citizens have a role to play in ensuring that we promote this, we forge a new global consensus, to build, to protect first the gains that we've made in terms of international law. And I think it's significant. South Africa's effective use of international law at the International Court of Justice has to be highlighted, to ensure that all the gains that we have made are not simply undone and thrown out, with the current disruptions that are facing the global system today going forward. So there's a lot for us to do as citizens. Everybody should familiarize themselves with this Article 109 and also engage, for example, with the United Nations Charter Reform Coalition, of which the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation is a member. And you can find details about that on social media platforms. Thanks, Janet.
Thanks, Tim. That's really helpful and helpful to sort of zero in on the mechanisms for this sort of reform of the UN system and of international law. It very much a challenge in that it at once set up a sort of 5 decades of peace, relative peace, and at the same time was in many ways unjust to smaller countries and the developing world. So really finding a way to infuse those institutions with the kinds of constitutional principles South Africa has is critical. I am going to just check the comments. I think we've covered most of what people have asked. We've got only 10 minutes left. And so what I was thinking is just to sort of wrap up this conversation what's been on my mind thinking about Zelensky and Ramaphosa sitting across the table from each other or sitting in chairs next to each other. What is the concrete thing you would say to them as they embark on a conversation about the relationship between South Africa and Ukraine? What's a concrete message you would make sure gets across in that forum? Maybe Tim, we'll start with you again.
Thanks, Janet. Yes, would be wonderful to sit around the table with these two gentlemen. Just to say, I think solidarity, global solidarity, global solidarity on issues that are crucial for the protection of people is vital. We have to stand together. We have to build those links, despite the sentiment by some that power might makes right. I think we have to push back against that, because if we all go down that pathway, we as human beings will in fact be creating the conditions for our own self-destruction and the further destruction of our environment as human beings. So I would definitely say let's work together in much more concrete pathways. But given the fact that I have this audience with these two eminent presidents, I would encourage both of their governments to, in fact, pick up this issue of the invoking a general conference to review the United Nations Charter and invoke Article 109 because we can see the more major powers of the world are in fact violating the system that they help to create. And so if we don't come up with something new, I think the pathway is for humanity. It does not look so rosy going forward. And that would be my specific message. And obviously, people to people solidarity is vital, and engagement like this and this platform becomes crucial in terms of ensuring that we understand each other and can forge those partnerships that will help to push things forward. Thanks, Janet.
Thanks, Tim. Really helpful. Zvonka, what would you say?
I think because you are talking about presidents that held a lot of power, the first thing I would ask, abolish visas between the two countries, because it would allow us to learn about each other so much better. Currently, it remains extremely difficult for Ukrainians to travel to South Africa. As part of Ukrainian Association of South Africa, we are trying to arrange more civil society delegations. And not only they need to travel to Warsaw to apply for visa in person, then wait for 3 weeks and then go back. It's the process of application. It remains extremely difficult, which makes those civil society collaborations and expert meetings extremely difficult. So I think it's time for both countries to open the visa regime so that people can travel freely. I also think there is so much between South Africa and Ukraine in common, and we just need to be speaking loudly about that, about children's rights, about nuclear safety, about UN reform. We are on the same page in that. I think we can, continue playing that this is a time for the global big powers, but the truth is that neither Ukraine nor South Africa are really interested in the world of big powers. Thank you.
Thanks, Venka. And Priyal, our sort of geopolitics expert.
No, I'd like to echo Prof. Maurizi's words on solidarity and also Zvinka's words on visas as a very practical issue. But if I was around the table with Zelensky and Ramaphosa, I think what I would suggest is to have a frank and open discussion just amongst the two leaders on what is their specific view on how to deal with the United States, how to deal with Russia, how to deal with China, how do they view these countries over the next 5 or 10 years, and to understand each other's respective foreign policies with respect to each of these major world powers. I think that's a critical discussion for them to have, because I think there's confusion or just a general misunderstanding between certain countries on how are they going to respond to this changing global environment. So I think a common understanding amongst these leaders would be extremely beneficial. And the second point I'd make is that, again, at this moment in time, countries who we would consider not to be major world powers have a common challenge before them. And the common challenge is to prove that, the peace, the relative peace, the relative development, the relative prosperity we've all as a global community enjoyed since the end of the Second World War should not be understood solely as a function of US hegemony or US power on the world stage. We all have a vested interest, we all have a role to play, and a vested interest in making sure that even if the chief architect and steward of that international order turns its back on that order and retreats, all of us can collectively still uphold those values, those principles. And countries like South Africa and Ukraine are absolutely vital and critical in making sure that that system survives, it endures, and it can adapt to meet the demands that we will be confronted with in the future. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And it's really struck me in this conversation, I guess, just really defining a just peace as dealing not just with negotiations around the table for the present, but thinking about the impact on civilians, the impact on victims of these atrocities. Zvínka, as you say, 20,000 children removed from Ukraine. And South Africa's example of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I think, is mixed in how things have turned out, partly because we didn't have mechanisms to follow through the recommendations. And so something worth thinking about in terms of, in these transitional justice processes, what powers are there to ensure that there's a follow through of justice, of reparations, as we go through things. Very, very powerful to think about the current state of the situation in Ukraine, 20% occupied territories, and Russia's ongoing aggression. And then I really preeled this idea of South Africa strengthening its position in defense of international law, taking on, as you say, a constitutionally based perspective rather than an ideological one is a very, very powerful idea. So thank you all for joining us today. It's been a fantastic conversation, and I hope you do manage to carry on in the chat. Thank you to the Daily Maverick and to the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation for bringing us all together. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.